After a few days, Roland returned to the border town. Axe also brought all the information obtained from the interrogation. Roland furrowed his brows. This was just the vanguard force. The information Axe obtained revealed that Timothy dispatched one militia force after another to attack the western borders. He employed the same method to deal with Garcia in Greenwater Port. These forces consisted of criminals, rats, and mostly refugees gathered from various places. The intelligence from the enemy knights revealed that Timothy deceived these people, initially using verbal promises to appease them before having them ingest the first batch of pills. Consequently, they were then under the control of Timothy, as they sought more pills to alleviate their pain and cravings. This attack is merely meant to deplete the border town's resources. The fallen knight Sir Vincent believed that since the town had no walls, he estimated that around 1,000 militiamen who consumed the pills would result in approximately 3,000 casualties. This would be a severe blow to the border town. Meanwhile, he could observe Roland's response and the effectiveness of his tactics. Roland couldn't help but feel a burning hatred and frustration. Timothy was using wave after wave of cannon fodder. Even if Roland managed to emerge victorious without a scratch, it would still be a Pyrrhic victory. Compared to repelling Timothy's invasion, his primary concern was putting an end to this meaningless war. Otherwise, how long would it take for the population to flourish again once Grey Castle was unified? Roland knew that the month of the demons was approaching, and soon the entire western border would be covered in heavy snow, making it impossible for land travel. Timothy undoubtedly intended to act before the winter snow arrived. Roland closed his eyes, pondered for a moment, and continued, expressing his desire to stall this war. Sending envoys or diplomatic communications would be ineffective. Roland was determined to prevent Timothy from seizing the population. He planned to evacuate the people before Timothy could reach them. Additionally, he aimed to instill fear in Timothy regarding the western borders. For instance, allowing some prisoners to escape back to the capital city, spreading fear in the capital city. Despite the risk of exposing their tactics and weapons. However, since there's no way of them obtaining the manufacturing method, Roland wasn't concerned. Lastly, Roland intended to write a warning letter, foretelling the day of the attack in advance, and then launch an assault on the exact day. Roland had decided to attack from the sky. He was no longer the weak and insignificant newcomer who needed to hide himself under disguise. It was time to reveal his true power, step by step, and take Timothy's place on the political stage of Grey Castle. He wanted the kingdom's people to take notice of his presence. It had nothing to do with vanity but rather a form of promotion for his territory and influence. A kingdom filled with corpses and ruins would be of no use to him. Through this demonstration, he hoped to encourage more people to venture to the western borders and stand by his side. As promised, the Margaret Trading Company arrived at the border town. While enjoying a delicious feast, they discussed Garcia's black sail fleet. It was said that after plundering several cities, they sailed north along the coastline, and nobody knew where they had gone. Margaret inquired about the hot air balloon, so Roland led them to the backyard and taught them how to operate it, demonstrating its safety. Once inflated, the balloon remained unaffected by rain, impacts, fire, or even the pecking of birds. Margaret quickly grasped the key points and asked how many gas canisters were needed. Roland replied that it required around 5 or 6 canisters for a single hot air balloon. Margaret thought such alchemical technology would be quite expensive. Roland cleared his throat and employed excellent sales tactics, offering the first inflation of the balloon for free and even including a complimentary camouflage outfit. After the caravan departed, Roland let out a long sigh of relief. The treasury was once again filled, and he could finally begin expanding the population. He looked up at the sky, envisioning the construction of the city next year. The banks of the Crimson Water River would undoubtedly be dotted with residential houses. Roland decided to go and visit Anna in the backyard on the northern slope. Upon entering, the first thing that caught his eye was the floor covered in metal blocks. Roland was astonished to see that they had already reached over 2,000 in number. Anna mentioned that block 1057 was particularly sturdy, while 2284 excelled in both hardness and toughness. Lucia held a small notebook and reported that block 2284 contained 0.8% carbon and 15.2% unknown elements. The test conducted by Anna and Lucia were of great significance. Roland instructed Lucia to break down the ores into various raw materials, and then Anna would blend them with pure iron in different mass ratios, melt them together, and create test blocks to assess their performance. Although Roland knew that steel was essentially an iron-carbon alloy, with higher carbon content resulting in pig iron and no carbon resulting in pure iron, he was aware that carbon content within a specific range could be classified as steel. Furthermore, even the slightest fluctuation in carbon content could significantly alter the properties of the metal. Therefore, the first thing to be determined was the extent of this range. After a few encouraging words to the two witches, Roland sat back and quietly watched the two girls working. Although the autumn sun still shone brightly, it no longer carried the scorching heat of the summer. He felt a warm sensation throughout his body, accompanied by a long-lost sense of tranquility. He lost track of time as the courtyard gradually grew quiet. Suddenly, he felt a soft hand resting on his forehead. Lucia was nowhere in sight, but Anna stood before him. Roland was startled, and Anna warned him, saying, "Your Highness, be careful not to catch a cold." Anna looked into Roland's eyes and knew that he had something to tell her. Roland hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly shook his head. He held Anna's hand, feeling somewhat perplexed, and roughly explained the plan to expand the population. He mentioned the initial freedom of choice, but now, to save time, he had resorted to some half-enticing, half-coercive methods. Although he did this to prevent the civilians from being forcefully conscripted by Timothy and ultimately succumbing to the ravages of the pills, upon reflection, Roland realized that his actions were not so different from Timothy's. The only distinction lay in their respective goals. Anna covered the prince's mouth, understanding that Roland was concerned that others might not appreciate his actions, and he himself couldn't guarantee that all of his future goals were correct. Roland was unsure whether the means or the desired outcomes were more important. Before he could respond, Anna had already moved closer, holding his hands and whispered softly in his ear, assuring him that she would watch over him carefully. The environment on Slumbering Isle was improving day by day. Once airborne, Tilly could see the bustling crowds and lively markets below. It was no longer the secluded place where only around 300 witches resided in isolation. Through negotiations and agreements, they had established commercial connections with the surrounding islands. Tilly had even brought in a group of ordinary residents from some overcrowded village islands. Although they currently lived on the outskirts of the island, far from the witches, Tilly believed that one day Slumbering Isle would become a city where everyone would live together harmoniously. Tilly could temporarily fly using magic stones, but she hadn't figured out the underlying principles yet. Just as she was conversing with Ashes, a massive white bird descended from the sky. Due to its rapid descent, it crashed onto the ground, raising a cloud of dust. It was Maisie, who couldn't believe that Tilly was actually flying in the sky. Tilly playfully rubbed her cheek and asked Maisie how the witches from Slumbering Isle were doing in the border town. Maisie rummaged through her bag, searching for the letters. They had all entrusted Maisie to deliver them to Tilly, including one from Prince Roland. Ashes took out half of a muffin and offered a piece to Maisie, but she shook her head and instead stuffed a handful of fish jerky into her mouth, mumbling, "She went to play with Molly." With that, Maisie flew out of the courtyard, flapping her wings. Ashes felt that Maisie had grown bigger even more in the past month, both in size and maturity. Tilly smiled and said she felt the same, perhaps because life in the border town was truly wonderful. Returning to the room, Tilly tore open the letter sent by Roland and found that apart from a letter filled with content, the remaining dozen or so pages were actually vivid illustrations, laying out the pages of drawings one by one. The contents were somewhat unbelievable and terrifying. The background depicted a desolate wasteland at dusk, with two monstrous creatures engaged in a fierce battle against a group of witches. The witches were clearly at a disadvantage, as their abilities seemed to have lost their effectiveness. Neither snakes nor fireballs could stop the enemy's advance. By the final drawing, several witches lay lifeless in pools of blood. Tilly anxiously grabbed the letter and quickly skimmed through its contents. Soon, she felt her heart tighten as a recurring word in the letter made her hands tremble slightly: demons. The letter described how Hakura obtained an ancient book and led the witches across the Desolation Mountains in search of the Holy Mountain. However, they did not find the Holy Mountain but encountered terrifying monsters instead. These creatures possessed astonishing strength, swift movements, and the ability to command demonic beasts. One of them could even release lightning from its hands. After contemplating for a while and finding no answers, Tilly decided to set aside all of those things and took out Sylvie's letter. She intended to know the results of investigating the Lord of the border town. However, the first sentence of the letter left her stunned, even more so than when she had seen the word demons. Lady Tilly, I have found no traces of disguise or magical influence on Roland Wimbledon. Apart from the Witch Union, there are no other factions of witches hidden in the town. So, I believe, he might be your true brother. Tilly was left speechless, shocked by the revelation in Sylvie's letter. A real brother. How could that be possible? Tilly held the letter in her hands, but her mind couldn't focus. Thoughts swirled in her head like a tidal wave. Among the 5 children of Wimbledon III, the eldest 3 were born close in age and played together. By the time Roland was born, the youngest, Garcia, was already 6 years old, and naturally, they didn't include him in their group. Logically, Tilly should have formed another circle with Roland, but it wasn't the case in reality. Roland longed to be accepted by his 2 older brothers, striving to fit into their circle, but often ended up being the one who was getting bullied. This twisted and volatile treatment caused Roland's character to become distorted and easily angered. Of course, he didn't dare to direct his anger towards the 3 elder siblings, so started bullying Tilly. Ever since Tilly fought back, Roland hadn't provoked her again, and Tilly had chosen to ignore her brother. Even in adulthood, Roland had shown no signs of change. In fact, he had worsened over time. She couldn't believe it. How could someone like him stand with the witches, sheltering them, and even dare to oppose the church? Tilly was perplexed and conflicted. It seemed contradictory to her that someone with Roland's history of bullying and twisted character could now align himself with the very beings he had once despised. The fact that he was willing to go against the church, an institution that held immense power and influence, further intensified her confusion and disbelief. Tilly didn't know what to say for a moment. Ashes nudged her several times before Tilly mentioned that the letter stated that Roland hadn't been controlled or replaced by the witches. When she mentioned the incident with the butt grabbing, Ashes coughed a couple of times. After contemplating for a moment, she remarked that even though they hadn't seen him for just a year, he seemed like a completely different person. Tilly asked Ashes to elaborate further. Ashes thought for a moment and said, Roland feels clean. Although he doesn't have a preference for extravagant jewelry or clothing like nobles do, his attire is very clean. Overall, Roland now gave a favorable impression. Tilly smiled, surprised that Ashes would speak well of him. She let out a sigh of relief, realizing that her brother had indeed undergone significant changes. But what had prompted his transformation? Perhaps the true reason could only be discovered by meeting him in person. Regaining her focus, Tilly shifted her attention back to the letter. The second half of the letter detailed Sylvie's observations and experiences in the border town, including her daily work and discoveries. As Tilly continued reading, another piece of information caught her attention. It described a weapon capable of launching iron balls and crossbow bolts from iron tubes, with immense power. Although Maisie and Ashes had mentioned such a weapon before, this was the first time Tilly had encountered such a detailed description, complete with hand-drawn illustrations. Ashes suggested that Tilly ask Roland to send a batch of those weapons in her reply. However, Tilly shook her head, explaining that allies should not be approached with suspicion. Such a test would only undermine the trust they had painstakingly built. Besides, they were planning to visit the border town this winter, and it would be better to discuss it in person. Ashes shrugged in response, and Tilly smiled, continuing to read the letter. As her eyes reached the end of the letter, Tilly couldn't help but freeze. Roland had actually invented a type of undergarment designed for women's boing boings and had gifted it to every adult female member of the witch union as a present? It was simply absurd. Wait a minute, Tilly suddenly remembered that when Roland was in the capital, he had also given some noble ladies tight-fitting corsets. Some of them had even been thrown back at his face. This was wildly spread among the nobles. This was definitely something he would do. Tilly felt conflicted. On one hand, it aligned with her memories of him, but on the other hand, she felt that it would be better if he didn't align with those memories. Should she go to the border town to see him this winter or not? Upon returning to the border town, as soon as they entered, Kyle mentioned that he had come up with a feasible plan for large-scale production of sulfuric acid. However, it required a significant amount of lead and skilled craftsmen, and he hoped to seek the assistance of the witches. Roland asked Kyle to provide him with the detailed plan. Then, Roland gestured for him to sit down and taught him another task. Kyle shook his head repeatedly, stating that he didn't have time recently as large-scale acid production was a challenging endeavor that required his full attention. Roland reassured him, saying that it wouldn't require much time. Seeing Kyle's puzzled expression, Roland requested him to manufacture more soap. Kyle immediately recalled the saponification reaction mentioned in elementary chemistry, which involves the reaction between sodium hydroxide and fats or oils to produce alcohol and salt. It was indeed an unusual feeling to hear standard chemical terms from an alchemist's mouth. Roland nodded in agreement, and Kyle still seemed a bit puzzled. It didn't seem important to him, but the prince emphasized that it was crucial. While soap production itself might not be important, the byproduct of the production process was something Roland urgently needed. Kyle immediately realized it was alcohol, and Roland confirmed that he needed alcohol, or glycerin to be exact, as it was a highly important ingredient. Kyle shrugged and said he would assign it to his apprentices, but he would demonstrate the process in front of a few clever apprentices chosen by him. Meanwhile, Roland shared some news with him, mentioning that a sailboat had arrived at the dock with 50 people on board, and one of them claimed to be an alchemist from Crimson Water City. Before Roland could finish his sentence, Kyle stood up excitedly. It was Charles, and he had truly brought his apprentices to join Kyle. Kyle exclaimed joyfully that Charles was his finest disciple, and he will surely fit for the job. Lightning checked her adventuring gear once again, which she carried with her at all times, including survival tools and weapons. Maisie also checked her own belongings, with piles of food laid out in front of Lightning. Lightning was at a loss for words. They were going on an adventure, not having a barbecue in the wilderness, at least bring a weapon. Maisie pointed at her beak, indicating that her beak was her weapon. Lightning sighed. After all, it was just a one-day trip, and they shouldn't encounter any major dangers. They were preparing to explore the westernmost part of the enchanted forest. Lightning had a little secret that she hadn't told anyone. She no longer dared to explore the forest alone. This was a great shame for an adventurer. However, she couldn't deceive herself. The journey to the stone tower had instilled fear in her towards this deep forest. Just the thought of those terrifying creatures potentially hiding somewhere in the forest made her want to escape as quickly as possible. Thunder had once mentioned to her a method to overcome fear, to gradually approach it, observe it, and understand it. Eventually, she would realize that fear wasn't as dreadful as it seemed. This exploration would be Lightning's attempt. With Maisie accompanying her, she felt a bit more confident. They had chosen a safe route, following the Crimson Water River westward without venturing deep into the forest. With this approach, it was unlikely they would encounter any demons. The two quickly approached the magnificent mountain. They had flown to the westernmost part of the forest, where the dark green expanse ended and the land transitioned back to a lighter shade of green. They arrived at a meadow. But as they ventured further, their line of sight was consumed by a pitch-black color that extended all the way to the base of the mountain. They descended towards the dark land. Soon, they realized it was a ground made up of black stones. Maisie pecked at it after landing and found it to be very hard. Lightning picked up a piece of the black stone and examined it closely, realizing that there were countless such stones scattered all around. She collected a few pieces, intending to show them to His Highness upon their return. Lightning called for Maisie, instructing her not to move, and then put on her wind goggles. In an instant, she accelerated to her maximum speed. After flying for about half an hour, she could faintly see the landscape beyond the mountains. She came to a stop and carefully observed what lay ahead. At the edge of her vision, a layer of reddish-brown mist hung over the peaks of the mountains. Roland sat at his desk, pondering how to launch an air raid on the imperial palace of Capital City. Suddenly, he heard a tapping sound from behind the windows. When he turned around, he saw Lightning clinging to the window, looking panicked, while Maisie perched on top of Lightning's head, pecking at the glass. As Nightingale opened the window, the little girl flew into Roland's arms. He gently stroked Lightning's head and comforted her, asking what had happened. Black stones, cool. A huge snowy mountain, cool. Maisie landed on the desk and flapped her wings, delivering the report. With a serious expression, Lightning spoke up, saying she had seen a demon. Roland's face grew solemn, and he told her not to panic, urging her to take her time and calm down. After a while, Lightning raised her head from Prince Roland's arms. She had initially intended to draw the map of the forest, but instead, she discovered a massive mountain covered by a layer of reddish-brown dense fog. The fog was so thick that it resembled undissolved fresh blood, spreading westward without apparent boundaries. The scene was just like the one depicted in Soraya's drawing. After Roland relayed Lightning's findings to everyone, Scroll suggested further investigation of the area covered by the red fog. They needed to ascertain whether it would cross the mountain range and reach the continent along the coastline. Wendy nodded in agreement. They had to be prepared. As the two oldest witches in the Union, Scroll and Wendy were the backbone in the hearts of many witches. Although the others were still somewhat afraid, no one wanted to sit idly by and do nothing. Roland also leaned towards this proposed course of action. Seeing no objections from the group, the plan was essentially settled. The key now was how to implement it. Anna suggested using hot air balloons for reconnaissance. They could camouflage themselves in the sky, using the clouds as cover, and fly over from the sea. Lightning suggested bringing Sylvie along, and Roland nodded, saying he would go as well. As soon as he spoke, Wendy, Scroll, and Nightingale all simultaneously objected, stating that they couldn't let Roland take such risks. Roland, with a serious tone, responded that it wasn't a reckless act. He believed that the demons did not possess the ability to cross the vast sea and high mountains, otherwise, they would have already spread throughout the four kingdoms. They were gathered in the far west, and perhaps they weren't as terrifying as they seemed. There was another reason he didn't mention, one that made him more experienced than anyone in assessing the development of an alien civilization. If he could witness the demons and their cities with his own eyes, it would greatly help in formulating future development directions and counter-strategies. The witches still hesitated. Roland smiled and said that staying in the hot air balloon would definitely be safe. If there was any danger, he wouldn't have let the witches go in the first place. Seeing that their persuasion was ineffective, Nightingale was the first to change her stance. Roland could go, but he had to take Nightingale with him and couldn't leave her side. As he looked into her earnest eyes, Roland knew he couldn't refuse her. After considering it for a while, he announced that the expedition members would be himself, Anna, Wendy, Soraya, Sylvie, Nightingale, Lightning, and Maisie. They would depart in a week. Besides the necessary food, everyone had to carry a pistol, and during this week, everyone must practice diligently. After making the announcement, Roland finally had the time to examine the black mineral Lightning had brought back. He held it in his hand and waited, feeling a slight jump in his heart. In terms of weight, it was much lighter than ordinary stones, making it unlikely to be a metallic ore. It had a hard and lightweight exterior that reflected a metallic luster, and it was exposed on the surface. Could it be coal? Roland asked Anna to release flames, and under the scorching black fire, the stone quickly turned bright red and translucent. Roland immediately realized that it was high-quality anthracite coal. This unexpected discovery filled him with joy. Coal was not rare in Greycastle and was mainly used for kilns and heating. However, its applications were extremely wide-ranging. Before the prevalence of internal combustion engines, the blazing burning of coal fueled everything of steam power. After coking coal, it could replace charcoal for iron and steel smelting, making it much more environmentally friendly than excessive deforestation. Even in the age of electricity, coal could be used to produce coal gas, hydrogen gas, and asphalt, as well as for power generation. It could be considered an excellent and cost-effective fuel. Holding an open-pit coal mine in his hand was very important. The only question was how to develop it effectively. After thinking for a moment, Roland realized that they needed to construct more steamships and fully develop the mining fields in the area. By increasing the number of steamships, they could transport the mined coal more efficiently and expand their capabilities. This would not only meet the local demand for coal but also provide an opportunity for trade and economic growth. The development of the mining fields would require infrastructure, such as railways and processing facilities, to optimize the extraction and utilization of the coal resources. With this unexpected discovery, Roland saw the potential for significant advancements in their industrial development and energy supply. The coal mine would serve as a valuable resource, contributing to the prosperity and progress of their kingdom. In the palace of Greycastle, there was a loud bang as a copper bowl was turned upside down. This was something newly developed by the Alchemist Association of the capital. If used in larger quantities, its power could tear through armor. Timothy was delighted and rewarded the inventor with 25 gold, instructing him to start mass production of it. After the chief alchemist left, a knight remarked that while this invention appeared intimidating, it would be impossible to defeat knights with it. It required ignition to activate, and its effective range was only about half a step. Other knights voiced their agreement, and Timothy felt a twinge of anger. If it weren't for Garcia luring away the alchemist responsible for developing this item at the Alchemist Association, he would have already conquered Greycastle. At that moment, footsteps suddenly echoed outside the door. An anxious guard entered the palace hall and knelt down on one knee. He informed Timothy that the militia force sent by Greycastle to the western border seemed to have suffered heavy losses. The defeated soldiers had returned to the capital, and they had brought with them a letter of inquiry from Roland Wimbledon. Now, many people were aware of the situation and what was written on the letter. The letter stated that Timothy's foolish actions, attacking the western border, were a mistake, and he would pay the price for it. Roland declared that he would launch an attack on the capital in the early second month of autumn, and by then, everyone would witness Timothy's shaky hold on the throne.